Good afternoon. Welcome to our show again. We're glad you could join us. I'm Arthur Fite, and this is Freeman Fite. We are lawyers, of course, here in Anniston and Oxford area. And we're having this show as an education to you and to acquaint you with a little bit about things that you might want to know about in the legal field. We operate a law firm in Anniston at the Regions Bank building. Tonight we're going to pick up kind of where we left off in a recent broadcast talking about liability insurance. Now the reason that this can be important, it kind of depends on which side of the fence you might be on. For example, if you have injured somebody, as you all know, you want to have adequate liability coverage so that it doesn't come out of your pocket or they don't take your assets, and that somebody is there to defend you with it where it doesn't cost you anything out of your pocket. On the other hand, if you've been injured and somebody is at fault for causing that, you want to find a source for compensation to fairly compensate you for your injuries. Now, if you'll put that first graphic up on the screen, we'll back into where we were before. As you may remember, most people primary source of liability coverage is in an auto policy. Now, why is that? Number one, the state requires it. Number two, you'd be crazy not to have it, because if you are at fault, even though you didn't intend to cause an accident, and you seriously hurt somebody, who's gonna pay? Your liability insurance carrier, whoever that is going to do that, and they're going to furnish you an attorney without any cost to you of their choice. So, Freeman, tell me, what amount of coverage would you recommend that people carry?
Well, it would depend on where you are in your life, what your assets are, what you can afford. The minimum required is $25,000, but if you can afford more than that, then you should definitely get it.
Yeah. Okay, if you come back on the camera 2 on us again, then we'll try to continue with that discussion. So the minimum coverage, as Freeman mentioned, is $25,000. In this day and time, that's really not enough. When somebody goes to the hospital for a week, let's say, and they get totally well, that bill is astronomical. I was in the hospital in December for 4 days. My bill was $28,000, and I was not seriously hurt.
Well, it also, something else to take into consideration is if you have injured someone, it won't just be the medical bills that you have to worry about. So if you have the minimum policy and someone's into the hospital, you know, you're going to have an ambulance ride. You're going to have all these other things that are going to
test.
Right, tests, X-rays, MRIs that can be stacked together. They may only have $10,000 or $15,000 in medical bills, and you would say to yourself, well, that should be a $25,000 policy, should be enough to cover that. And sure, that's enough to cover those medical bills, but
maybe
the medical bills alone.
Yeah.
But you're also going to run into that person could be out of work,
lost wages,
pain and suffering. You don't ever know if that. Of course, there could be a permanent injury of some kind.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that can be put on top of each other to make that more expensive, where $25,000 might not be enough.
That's right. And so a bill that looks like, or claim that looks like it's going to be a small amount of money actually may mushroom substantially because of these other factors that lead into it. So we always recommend, if we're asked, that people carry more than the minimum required. I think $100,000 is something you can afford, if you can, that is, and that's the amount you ought to cover, or you ought to get coverage for. But there's another problem that we talked about in a recent show that's even worse than that. What if the other driver, Freeman, has no coverage? What can you do about that?
That's something we talked about in detail. The last show was underinsured, uninsured motorist coverage, which each company is required to offer you. And it's something that you should have, and it's also something that you should have as much as you can reasonably afford. I think the minimum they offer is $25,000. You know, if you can afford more than that, you should get it, because if someone does hit you and they don't have insurance or they don't have enough insurance, you're going to really want to have that to fall back on should your injuries or your lost wages or your pain and suffering be more than what that person has in a policy if they only have the minimum of $25,000, or if they have none at all?
Well, as you mentioned a minute ago, hospital stay this day and time is very expensive, even just for a few days. So if the person who's injured you doesn't have any insurance, even though he's required to do it, you can look at your own policy. And that's why we again recommend that you carry a minimum of 100 on uninsured or underinsured. Uninsured is if the other driver doesn't have any insurance. Underinsured is the same thing, except that the other driver has not enough insurance.
Even if you can't afford the 100, you should at least carry as much as you can.
Yeah.
If you can't afford the 100, that's fine, but you should, that shouldn't stop you from carrying 25 in uninsured coverage, because that's better than nothing.
And if you get hurt, and it's a bad injury, let's say you're in the hospital 2 or 3 weeks minimum, or you've lost a leg or something worse than that, those things are very hard to compensate you for. And usually if you don't have enough coverage available to cover that, you're not going to be made whole. And that's what the law requires, is for you to be made whole. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, how you collect on a judgment. Even if you may win one, you may not ever see any money. So that's important to do that. Now, let's talk a minute, Freeman, about who's an insured under a policy. You've got somebody driving your car with your permission. Are they insured?
Yeah, they'd be insured as a permissive driver. This can be a tricky area because sometimes you may talk to someone on the phone, and they may not really know the answers that you're going to ask. So it's always good to check with a lawyer just to make sure that you are indeed insured on a policy. You may be listed as a driver, you may be listed as an insured. Of course, that brings a whole lot of other issues. Do you live at home? For instance, if you're, a young man or woman, and you've lived at home with your mother or your parents, and you've always been under their policy, but then you move out, you need to make sure you're still insured, because once you move out, if you're not a named insured, you're not going to be.
In the second segment coming up, we'll talk a little bit about stacking coverages so you can obtain more insurance coverage. And then we're going to look at other things, other types of policies that will cover you or your accident if you need to. These are going to be interesting, so stay tuned and join us in a couple of seconds. Thank you. Welcome back to the show. At this part, we're going to talk a little bit more about uninsured coverage. We think that's extremely important. You make sure you buy whatever you can afford, but one thing that's good about the uninsured coverage, the expense of that is not great. The liability portion, the collision and comprehensive can have high premiums, but the uninsured portion is relatively inexpensive. And that's what you really need if you get hurt by a driver with no insurance. Talk a little bit, Freeman, about how you stack. What does that mean?
That's something we talked about in pretty great detail the last show. And stacking just means that if you have more than one car on a policy, say you have 3 cars on a policy, then you can stack the underinsured policies. So if you have 3 cars and you have $25,000 coverage for underinsured or uninsured motorist coverage, then that can become $75,000, because you can stack them if you are hurt in an accident with someone that doesn't have enough coverage or no coverage at all.
And if you have them all under one policy, you can stack as many cars as you've got. It's where you have individual policies that you can only limit it to 3. Now, that's an important source of coverage if you have a serious injury. Now, one note of caution, people who try to represent themselves run into this all the time. We see it. They settle their personal injury claim, and they do it in a way that causes them to lose and forego their rights to uninsured coverage. And a lawyer who does this work in this area can tell you, or can tell the insurance company to follow the right procedure so you don't lose that coverage. It's very important. We see that a lot. Let's go on to other types of insurance coverage that affords liability protection. Now, we put the graphic back up on there. If you own a home, you are, of course, required by your mortgage company, if you have one, and most people do, you're required to cover the property loss you may have, but you may not have thought about the liability coverage that's in there. And the liability coverage in there will cover you for things other than automobile accidents. Freeman, you want to comment a little bit on that?
Well, you may have a guest come to the house and they may take a fall or take a spill. You know, you may have a hole in your backyard that you know about and you don't let them know about it. And, you know, they fall and they're injured at your house.
I even had, I think I mentioned this on an earlier show, but I had a case 30 years ago where two young pre-teenagers got into a BB gun battle. This actually happened. They had a rule that you weren't supposed to shoot above waistline or chest line. Well, the one boy violated that rule and he shot the other guy in his eye and put his eye out. Now, where in the world are you going to get any kind of coverage for that kind of accident? Homeowners. That's where we looked. We got a copy of the policies. We found out how much coverage you had, by the way, and you can be required to reveal coverage amounts. There's a rule that requires it. Some people don't want to tell you. The insurance adjusters sure don't want to tell you, but you can make them. You can make them produce it. So we found the coverage, and then it became a question of, is the other kid liable or not? So that was where the battle was. But when it was resolved, the homeowners paid for this loss that this young man sustained. And thank goodness he had homeowners. So in your homeowner's policy, it's a great idea to be sure you know how much liability coverage you have. Again, it's not expensive, part of the premium for your homeowners. So find that out. Check on the premiums if you have it. If you have an accident occur on your property, you want enough coverage to take care of it because your automobile policy is not going to do it. And if you are hurt on somebody's property, you want to make sure that there's enough coverage to pay for whatever injury. Again, as we mentioned a minute ago, you go into a hospital now, the bills can be very high. And if you don't have any medical insurance, you can be made to pay for the whole thing, or at least they'll come after you. If you have medical insurance, there's always copays and deductibles. And I think we mentioned last time that these copays and deductibles have gone up a lot under the Affordable Care Act, it's called. And you'll be finding that out as you get a claim in sometime during, hopefully you don't get one, but when you do, you're going to be shocked at how much those copays and deductibles have gone up, as well as your premium for medical insurance. So you are hurt, you're going to have these unpaid for bills. You're going to hopefully have somebody out there who's got enough coverage to take care of you. There's another kind, Let's go to number 3, personal umbrella. And I bet there's not too many folks out there who know much about personal umbrella coverages. You want to tell us generally what it is, and I'll talk about it a little bit?
It's what you would think it would be as an umbrella. It protects you in the event, for instance, if you are in a car accident and you have $100,000 in coverage, but the bills are going to be over that. Say you're going to sue, and you're going to get sued, and you're going to be on the hook for $150,000. Then you can go to the umbrella to help produce the rest of that that's not covered by your auto policy.
I think the example you gave is great. Picture a real umbrella up here. You've got your basic coverage down here, and let's say that you are the one who causes the accident. You always got to look at it from both sides. You're the one that causes the accident, and some poor souls have been horribly injured. They're in that hospital for a month. That bill could be $250,000, but you only got $100,000 worth of coverage. Where can you find more? You buy a personal umbrella policy. Those are not very expensive, and they do require minimums in other policies. And so you've got that policy. It's not uncommon for people when they buy personal umbrella policies to get coverages in the $1 million, $2 million amount, because that will take care of almost everything that comes along, except some catastrophic event. Now, on personal umbrella policies, do require that you carry minimum insurance liabilities in, say, your auto, for example. Some umbrella policies may require you to carry $100,000 or $300,000 minimum liability on your automobile policy before it kicks in. If you don't carry the minimums, you're out of luck. So you've got to know that and make sure that these policies are coordinated if you're worried about protecting yourself. On the other hand, if you are coming at somebody for liability, one of the things we always look for, do you have a personal umbrella policy? Well, you can make them tell you that. What are your coverages? Once we know that, and if the liability is not in question, then we know we've got a source of funds to resolve the case at some point. At least we hope we do. And if you're the insured, you know, you're going to be very glad you got adequate coverage, because we're going to talk about it in a minute. It protects your assets, other things that you could lose. So I recommend that if you have any kind of assets at all of real value, that you look into getting yourself a personal umbrella policy. When we have a litigation involving a serious claim, and it has to be a pretty serious claim for this to kick in, we want to know that other policy. And most business people, people who do well, they're going to carry them because they know they need that protection. So that's what you ought to ask your agent about, is personal umbrella policies. Now there's a fourth category, if you put that back up real quick, is something called general liability. And that's carried by most businesses who have the public coming in to their place of business. People falling down, slip and fall cases in small businesses, it does happen. And if the liability is proved, they're going to have general liability. So if you're coming after somebody who you went on their store property or whatever business, whatever kind of business it is, they're going to have general liability, most of them, and that's where you look. If you operate a small business, you sure want to have it, because it's got to protect what you've built 20 or 30 years build up. So we're going to talk in the next segment about the process of resolving these claims and tell you how we kind of go through it. See you in about 4 or 5 seconds. Well, more than that. Okay, welcome back to the third and final segment of tonight's show. This time we're going to talk about the process that you have to go through or will need to go through in order to obtain compensation if you have a claim. But let me just mention at the outset, you have a claim, it doesn't mean that it's a good claim. I mean, we don't, for example, take lawsuits or claims that have no merit to them. You hear all this all the time about frivolous lawsuits. Well, we agree with that. If you got a frivolous lawsuit and there's really no claim for it, we don't want to fool with it either. But if you got a serious claim, we certainly want to take that on. Now, what happens when you got a claim? If you put that graphic up, we'll talk a little bit about it. Sue or get sued. Again, it depends on which end of the wrong you're on. If you committed the wrong, then you got a company that hopefully will take care of you. If you've been injured, this is kind of the process we go through. Before a lawsuit's filed, if it has to be, and we don't say it has to be in every time, a lot of times we don't do it, we just try to work it out, is negotiation. And when we do that, we get all the information, medical bills, lost wages. The pain and suffering element is one of those vague things we have to negotiate. Any other thing, a loss of use of your property, destruction of your property, so on, we negotiate. We try to negotiate. Sometimes that's not successful. When it doesn't work out, then what's the next step, generally, Freddie?
After negotiations fail, if they do, and you can't work out an agreement, then the only other option you're left with is to file a lawsuit against the driver that injured you.
If you're talking about automobile policy.
That's right.
Automobile wrecks. And when you do that, basically, these are the steps. If you'll come back off the graphic for a second. The steps when a lawsuit's filed, a lot of people don't know this, we get asked all the time. You file your complaint with the court. It goes to the clerk sends it to the sheriff, and the sheriff takes it out and serves it on whoever committed the wrong. That person then has 30 days normally, depends on which court you're in, but 30 days to answer the lawsuit, and you want to make sure he notifies his insurance company. So we sometimes write him a letter and say, please let your insurance company know, and then they come in and defend the lawsuit. After the lawsuit's filed, you continue an effort to negotiate. You can settle a case anywhere along the line. Then you may go to mediation. And mediation's not a bad idea. I do not like arbitration. Let me tell you what the difference is, because we get asked this a lot. Freeman, why don't you tell them the difference between mediation and arbitration? Mediation,
most of the time, it can be compelled by the court sometimes, but most of the time it's going to be voluntary, and you're going to basically have both sides appear before a mediator who will be a lawyer or an ex-judge, and you will tell the mediator what you think your strong points are, what the other side's weak points are, and the other side will do the same, and that mediator will try to make each side see the other side's points. He'll make the plaintiff look at the defendant's good points and vice versa, and see if an agreement can be reached that way. Arbitration is different in a way that it'll be through a contract. When you sign, or it could be even an invoice, you're agreeing, for instance, if you buy a car, now almost 100% of the time when you sign to buy a car or what have you, you're agreeing to go to arbitration if something were to happen.
Well, talk about which one you can enforce and which one is kind of a voluntary thing.
Most of the time, mediation is going to be voluntary and non-binding. There is binding mediation in some states. Arbitration is going to be enforced, and you're going to have an arbiter that'll decide your case, and then it'll be ratified by a court later on.
Yeah. My experience is that mediation is not a bad idea, especially where the parties are both reasonable, and that sometimes is questionable. You get some hard-headed people. But mediation can help with a neutral. The person's called a neutral. He comes in and explains, here's your side. He explains the strengths and weaknesses. A lot of time people don't realize their own weaknesses, their own cases. We could sit there and tell them we're blue in the face, but they don't believe it sometimes. So when we have a neutral who's a mediator, he carries a little bit more of a credibility sometimes because he's not on anybody's side. And he'll help try to resolve the lawsuit. But sometimes that doesn't work. Arbitration, on the other hand, that's the end of the road. When the arbitrator issues his decision, it's binding and enforceable, and you can't go anyplace else. But if mediation fails, you still have your option to go to court if you want to. And if you don't like the result there, you have an option to appeal. Doesn't mean you're going to win it, but you have that option available to you. So I like mediation. It gives you a lot more opportunities, a lot more room to negotiate, and that's where the lawyer's skill often comes in, is at the negotiation during the mediation. And if that doesn't work, then where his skill will come in is an actual trial of the lawsuit. And that's the fourth thing in the process. If that doesn't work, you will go to trial. And you go to trial, you get 12 people, and you always hear this of their peers. Well, that never happens. You don't get your peers. No telling who you're going to get. We don't know. And until we get to court, we know who those 12 people are going to be. So then that jury trial results in a verdict for somebody. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And sometimes you're able to, that helps the negotiation process when both sides realize it's all or nothing. You're going to win or you're going to lose. So the trial then is over with. What do you get if you win? Let's say you're suing, you've got serious injury. Let's say you got a $500,000 judgment. How do you collect that? What do you do with that judgment? It doesn't mean that somebody's just going to pay you. Well, these are the ways that we put on the screen for judgments to be paid. I put insurance as the last one. That usually actually is the most viable form, is to collect judgment. The insurance, by the way, does not have to pay the full amount of the judgment, only the amount of coverage that's provided. So if you have a $100,000 verdict and you've got a $25,000 policy, they only have to pay $25,000. What else can you do? What else can the lawyer do? Several other ways to do this. He can find if he's got a job somewhere, he can garnish. File a garnishment, the employer has to withhold money. And
you can also garnish a bank account.
Yeah, bank account. Swoop in there and swoop it out, whatever you have in there.
I've actually filed them before in the past
for
one of our clients where we didn't know where the person was banking, and I filed it for every bank in that person's town.
Okay.
Hoping we would hit one, and we did.
Yeah, you have to do that sometimes. What about seizure?
Seizure's an option. That's probably, in my opinion, the most difficult.
You've got to, in that case, you've got to find a piece of property or a car or something, and you have to describe it. And an order is entered by the court, and the sheriff goes out and takes it.
Yeah.
Now, what if you got a car out there, but it's worth $5,000 and is The amount owed is $4,500. Are you going to go after that? No. So, it's not always a good option, but it is an option. All right, last item we want to talk about is if you...
we didn't go. We forgot to go into recording the judgment.
Right. It's very important to record the judgments, Freeman, and tell our audience why you want to record a judgment.
You want to record the judgment because where you record the judgment in that county, any property the person has, a lien is put on that property for a period of 10 years, and you're allowed to renew it then. So if they have a house and they try to sell it, you can bet that lien will come up. Let me interrupt you and tell you one
thing about that. I've had a judgment recorded, and as much as 8 years later, they come back and want to pay it off because they're trying to buy a piece of property or trying to sell a piece of property they can't do with that lien. So it's important to do that. If you have a question, give us a call. We'll try to answer it.